going on, guys? So as you can see from the thumbnail, I'm a Miata owner now. Well, technically I bought it for the wife because her first new or newish car to her when she started driving was a 91 Miata. So I thought it would be really cool to bring this home and have her be able to drive it some and kind of remember the cool experiences of having a Miata. And after that 91, she had two additional Miatas. She had a 98 and an 04. So that was the excuse I gave to be able to buy this thing and bring it home. Because honestly, I had never driven Miatas too much or even really had too much of an interest in Miatas. But this one kind of fell into my lap. It was the right color and it's absurdly clean and nice. Now Mazda made over 400,000 Miatas between 90 and 97 on these early cars, and driving it for a little while, I can see why they sold so well. They're a really nice, nimble, tight, good handling driving car that seems to work great in town as it does out on the highway. Now there's not a lot of storage room obviously with a convertible vehicle and a small trunk, but it's a really fun car to drive. These early cars with the 1.6 liter only have about 115 horsepower and 100 foot-pounds of torque. And in today's standards, that's not very much. Definitely when you consider this old 85 RX-7 had 130 horsepower. So with that 115 horsepower, you're only hitting a 0 to 60 time of around 8.3 seconds versus this 5-year older car that's able to hit it in the 6s or 7s. So it definitely wasn't a progression in performance, but it was just a new, lightweight, economical vehicle. And we can get into pricing because in 90, these had a price starting around $14,000. So if you change that to pricing now, that was around $27,000, which is still extremely cheap for a brand new vehicle. If you take this 5-year older Mazda RX-7 that had a price around $17,000, at least in this high trim level vehicle, you would have had a today purchase price of around $40,000. So you can see why they sold so many of these Miatas, because they were a good price point, economical, and fun vehicle to drive. Now this Miata specifically is decently optioned. It's got power steering, air conditioning, but it does not have power windows. So it has crank windows, and it unfortunately did not get the hardtop option. But this one did get the VLSD, or the viscous limited slip differential. Now it's not as effective as something more new and modern, but it at least has it, so surely it's doing something back there. Now let's take a quick look around this thing and see how it's held up to 30 or 31 years of life. Now this car does only have 31,000 miles, so it has spent a lot of its life stored away in a garage. So let's do a quick look around it, look inside of it, and then we'll take it out on the road. So guys, as we walk around this thing, we can see how obscenely clean and non-rusty this is. Our rockers are still there. The wheels are in good shape. There is just not much bad going on with this thing. Now, you probably won't be able to tell on camera, but if we get in the light right, you can see we definitely need to get a paint correction done. And we can see how beautifully the RX-7 turned out. So we will eventually get the paint buffed, polished, corrected. But before that, we need to go through and do all of our work, parts replacement. And as we jump into the interior, obviously this thing needs cleaned really badly. We need to vacuum, wipe everything down, but everything's there. Everything's good, nothing's missing. One thing we do need to address inside is this radio bezel. It is cracked all over. So, luckily Mazda still has those new available from the dealer. So we will be able to grab one of those, pick one of those up, and have the interior looking even nicer. We can see the ridiculous 31,000 miles on this thing. So, like I said, this thing has been in a garage for its life. Now we can jump under the hood, and this thing is as stock as it can be. No intake, no nothing. And maybe some Miata guys will be able to tell me, but the plug wires at least look original. We'll see if somebody is able to correct me or not on that, but this thing is very, very stock. We need to get all the fluids changed, replace some of those trim pieces, and try to just get this thing super dialed in. So now that we are out in the car, this is honestly about the second or third time I've even driven it since I drove it home. And my initial impressions are, it's really small in here. It feels maybe more cramped than the RX-7, but it's nicer. I think it seems a little more modern, a little newer. Obviously it is 5 years newer, but you still see a lot of kind of touches of the RX-7 in this car and vice versa. That was the same thought process, I guess, behind both cars. And like I said, I've never ever really driven a Miata. I've moved one around a parking lot, drove it down a side road, but I've never driven it out on the highway to feel the power or lack of power, I guess. And it honestly does feel very similar to the RX-7. Obviously the power band is a little bit differently in how it pulls, but the same feel, handling, that all feels very reminiscent of the RX-7. One thing I did notice driving home with it the first night, when I was getting on the highway and looking up at every other vehicle that looked massive like a monster truck, you really have to watch where you're driving, but you also really need to watch where other people are driving. This car just seems so much smaller than anything else on the road right now, and that's because it is. These are micro cars compared to everything now that just continually gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So you really need to be a defensive driver. Watch what you're doing, because if you aren't watching for that big truck next to you, they aren't going to see you. They're going to look right over the roof of the car and see nothing. And I honestly haven't ever been that huge of a fan of Miatas. They're fine. I never had anything against them, but it was never a car that I, lusted after, wanted to buy, looked for. But driving this, I can understand why there's so many people that really love these things and modify them and really, really enjoy them. It's a nice, tight, good handling car. Now, I do play with a bunch of Miatas on track. I've got a bunch of buddies that have Miatas, and we all run on the same road course. I, of course, am running a 650 horse Camaro while they are in their 115 horsepower Miatas. And you'd think I'd just blow them away. And of course, on the straightaways I do. But what's really, really interesting is the corners. Cornering speeds of a well set up Miata, with suspension, tires,
and a good driver behind the wheel, I really don't annihilate them in the corners. We all kind of are at the same skill level driving, and honestly, I'll pace with them in the corners, or when they're behind me going into the corners, I'm not leaving them in the dust. We are all very well paced with the buddies with the Miatas, and I've got a buddy with an FRS, and like I said, we all play on track, and it is very interesting to see how much work it does take for me, even in the big bad Camaro, to pace with them in the corners and the twisty sections of the track. I luckily then am able to use my excessive power on the straightaways to make up for my poor driving skill, but these cars really can hold their own out on the track and autocross course. So we are going to pull onto the highway here. We are going to go from a stop and get on it. We are foot on the floor in first gear, and we're at 50, and we're at 60. So it's really hard to tell. I'm trying to figure out what feels quicker, the RX-7 or this. And I feel like the RX-7 maybe pulls a little harder in the higher RPMs, but they both feel very similar. You'll see out at autocrosses tons and tons of Miatas. They are probably one of the most plentiful cars, at least in our area, out on the autocross track. And that's where they really shine, on small, tight courses. The same buddies that I go play on the racetrack with, we also autocross with, and most times, a few of them will completely annihilate the Camaro's times on an autocross track because they're able to stay on throttle, stay, working through the course so much smoother than a big, huge, heavy power car. And it's really course dependent on if I can hang with them or beat them on the results. So they just work really well on an autocross course. Also, in just a really short time of driving this, I've noticed how nice you can rev match downshift. I don't know if it's the engine's rev happiness or the small lightweight flywheel transmission setup, but you can rev match downshift really easily with this car. It blips right up to where it needs to be. In the Camaro, I've got the auto rev match downshifting, and that's great, but this car works really well as a true purist sports car. So let's get back in the garage and we'll kind of talk about what the plan is for this car.
So the plan for this car, that's kind of where I'm running into issues, because the track guy in me wants to do suspension, brakes, wheels, tires, a roll bar, and go out and take this thing on the track and autocross. But the car enthusiast in me worries that we kind of need to save some of these nice early low mileage examples. And doing some of those modifications would hurt the car's value, or it would hurt the fact that there are so few of these nice low mileage examples still out there. So we could do some of those suspension modifications, new shocks, tires, and keep all of those old original parts so the car could be returned back to stock. But I just haven't figured that out yet. So for the time being, we at least need to completely go through this thing, replace any of the trim pieces that we can get. We've got some badges, do all the maintenance, fluids, spark plugs, gaskets, that kind of stuff that this thing has not had for its whole life. So we will do all of that stuff first. Hopefully the next video on this thing, we will have those parts, be able to throw some of them on, and maybe you guys can help me decide what should we do to this thing, how much can we do to it without hurting keeping an original NA Miata in the world. So, like I said, we've got some of those little interior pieces, that radio bezel, the few little parts and pieces we need, and at least let's get this thing dialed and looking as factory fresh as we can, and we'll go from there. So, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.